Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for Airman Certification Standards Part 2. My name is Gabrielle and I'm one of the flight coordinators at the airport. Before we get started, just a reminder, if you have any questions, you can put it in the chat. You can unmute yourself and interact with Andrew and Joe. And if you have any ideas for future webinars, please let us know. Oh, nice background there, Christoph. And with that being said, I will hand you off to Andrew and Joe.
All right.
Welcome back, everybody.
Yep. So this is going to be part 2. We'll go over everything more about the maneuvers tonight. Talk a little bit about some of the stuff, some common errors with it, some things that we want to specify on that we may think the examiners are going to pinpoint on, and go over all that. All right. So can everyone see my screen all right? Perfect. All right.
All right, gotta give us thumbs up. All right, so I'm Joe. I've been a CFI at Princeton since February of 2023. Currently working towards getting my II as well as my multi-engine ratings, and hoping to go to an airline soon.
All right, and my name's Andrew. I've been teaching at Princeton since July of 2023. I'm a CFI and a II, and some things while I'm not flying, I'm either out on the boat or doing, I'm also a volunteer firefighter on the side.
All right, so as Andrew said before, we're going to focus on more so the ACS maneuvers. So last webinar, we talked a little bit about how to read the ACS, what it is.
Some of the oral parts.
For those of you who are unfamiliar, it stands for the Airman Certification Standards. It's a big book of standards.
There's a whole chart and a list of everything you got to follow.
Right. So let's dig into it.
Yep.
So the first maneuver that we want to talk about is one of the most basic ones: take off and climb.
Where the flight starts.
So the first thing is knowing the difference between VX and VY. That's something I've been seeing a lot of. Well, not a lot, but I've seen a couple of students that will initially climb out at VX and then transition to VY.
And there's certain times when to use it and when not to use it.
Right. And if you look at the ACS standards in the skills portion, it does state that, you should be maintaining VY plus 10 minus 5 a safe maneuvering altitude.
So in our Cessna, that would be
for our VY. Most of the Cessnas are between 70 to 80 knots as specified.
Yep. And then VX
aim for 75.
Yeah. Exactly. So a normal climb out 75, and then we do some short field, which we'll talk about later. We'll talk about the airspeed when we get to that point.
And for those of you who might be unfamiliar with what VX and VY are, so VX is going to be our best angle of climb as seen by that yellow line. Gives us the go ahead, I'm sorry.
And there you go. So we can see here kind of how they're different, right? So one gives us our best climb and the most amount of altitude gained in a given amount of distance, and the other VY is the most amount of altitude gained in an amount of time, right? So we would want to use VX in what scenarios?
Short field takeoffs or obstacles at the end of the runway. So
climbing above the trees here, as we can see, right? Maybe we need to climb VX because if we climb VY, there's a possibility, are those trees high enough to be in where I'm flying at? So VX, distance, VY, amount of time. So that's why when we're climbing for a while, we climb at VY. Otherwise, we're climbing at VX. We may get up to our altitude faster, but we're not going to cover much distance. And your cross-country flight may be a little bit longer, especially depending on what altitude you're going to.
All right. So also important to note with just the normal takeoff and climbs is putting in your wing corrections for crosswinds and possible tailwinds. And add on that.
Cool.
All right.
So we have our takeoff and climbs. Now we gotta come back into landing.
All right. So as always, complete the appropriate checklist for landing. That's going to pop up a lot in the ACS. I believe 27 times, you said?
Yeah, I
But
think.
who's counting?
So always use that checklist, especially on a check ride. Never hesitate to pull that paper out. I know it's annoying, but there's a lot of things sometimes you may forget that if you don't follow that checklist, you could be taken off with full flaps.
So the skills that they're looking for in the ACS, making sure that you can maintain your approach speed, make a smooth, timely, correct control application during round out and touchdown. So they're just making sure that you can fly a stabilized approach to a smooth landing, more or less.
Knowing that you're not becoming unstable in their approach and thinking, oh, I can land, I can get it down still.
Right. And if you look at the risk management, a go around is perfectly acceptable if you do feel as though you're flying an unstable approach. You can always go around, even on a check ride. The ACS is even in favor of it. I mean, if you do 6 go arounds in a row, then the examiner might have some
maybe. Yeah.
But
and remember, everyone talks about the time you didn't go around, never a time you did go around. So never be afraid to go around.
Good.
And also when we come in the land, right, we have our speeds, which is normally 65 knots in our Cessna when we come in on that final approach. The other thing, as we look down here, we can see we need to maintain plus 10 or minus 5 knots, right?
Right.
So if 65 is your 1.3 times the VSO, you can go up to 75, but you can't go below 60. And the other addition to this is they probably won't ask this on the test, but this is just good knowledge to know. Also, with the gust factor applied. So tomorrow is going to be a windy day, right? It's going to be, I think the METAR was saying, what, 17?
17 gusting 27.
So we have a 10 knot gust factor there. So the FAA wants us to increase our approach speed by
half of the gust factor.
Yep. So in this case, if it's 10 knots, we would add 5 knots to our approach speed. So instead of coming at 65 knots, we'd come in right at about 70.
Cool. All right. So just as important as the landing, traffic patterns. All right. So ACS is looking at, the right-of-way rules. You know how to use automated weather, airport information. And you know how to exit and enter the traffic pattern, correcting for any sorts of wind drift. They want you to maintain your altitude plus or minus 100 feet and appropriate airspeeds plus or minus 10 knots.
And don't forget to come in on that 45-degree angle.
Right.
Sometimes, I mean, you've had students, right? He had the examiner sitting outside,
watching him,
waiting for him to come in. And what did
he was watching him? He thought he was going to come in on a straight in. He saw him kind of come out and enter on a 45. So he walked in. He was telling him, "Oh, you earned a couple brownie points for that alone."
That's why you're not. Remember, they could always be watching, especially the day you go for your check ride. So always enter properly. I know sometimes we enter different ways, but always try to enter on a 45, right? It gives you a great situational awareness. Because if I come in on any other angle, it's going to be difficult for me to see traffic, any other planes in the pattern, right? So we want to make sure we're aware of where the other planes are at, and I can get a good visual coming into that traffic pattern. I don't want to be coming in blind.
All right. So also on top of that, I think it's important to kind of note the traffic pattern altitudes. So if you have a destination airport in mind for your check ride, make sure you're doing your homework ahead of time. On the next slide, we have a snip of the chart supplement. And if you look at that first highlighted box in red, it says TPA 853. So not every airport will have that typical rule of thumb where you just add 1,000 to field elevation. So you want to be mindful of that because some airports it's going to be higher than just that 1,000, and it might be for obstacle clearance.
Or it could also be right-hand pattern. I know Robbinsville is the one with right-hand pattern for 29.
South Jersey also has the right pattern.
Yes, there's South Jersey and what's the other airport that's real close to that? Flying W. They're like right next to each other, and they're on the same frequency. So if you ever fly there, it gets a little bit congested if it's busy. So that's why you want to study these charts before you get there.
Right.
And then we also have some resources about, they have an advisory circular about traffic patterns. They go more in depth into it. And also,
You could also check in the AIM Part 431 for some more information. The FAR 91-113 for the right-of-way rules. And that's all I got for that.
traffic.
All right.
So now, after a traffic pattern, we may be landing on a soft field. So what is a soft field?
Grass.
Yep, grass runways.
Yep.
If they're wet, if it's been raining, never want to land on them.
Not
Always
a great
want to
time.
dry, and always inspect it if you're going to use it.
Right. Definitely have to do some homework beforehand.
Yes.
Grass. But
And
of course,
it's
there's
plain dirty.
Right. Of course, there is a special technique for taking off and landing on grass runways. So, first step, you want to consult your POH to make sure that you're in the proper flap configuration. I know for Cessnas, it's 10 degrees. For the Archers, it is 25. So 2 notches. Apply the appropriate amount of back pressure on before you cross over on the runway. On your private pilot check ride, I can almost guarantee it's going to be a simulated grass takeoff and landing.
You're probably not actually going to be landing on the grass.
Right. So you still want to apply the appropriate amount of back pressure before crossing onto the runway. Avoid using brakes. After you apply full power, you're going to accelerate to VX or VY in ground effect. Kind of like you can ask the examiner if they want which they want you to go to.
VX or VY, and they may tell you whichever one you feel more comfortable at. If they say, "Oh, there may be trees at the end of the runway that may be a little bit high," maybe they may want you to do VX. Then they may be giving you an actual example of it. So you may want to come out the VX, but it's whatever you specify.
Right.
The main thing with this is protect that nose wheel, right? Because if that nose wheel goes into the ground, if there's a rut or anything, you could possibly get a prop strike, damage the nose wheel. So that's why we essentially want to do the wheelie going down the runway.
I love soft field tape.
You just look up and all of a sudden the sky's right there.
All right.
So here's what the ACS pretty much says, the chart, everything. So as
far as just these standards with it, like I said, establish a pitch attitude for VX or VY. It's going to depend on the scenario. And plus 10 minus 5.
Yep. And as we see here, we want to lift off at the lowest possible airspeed. So that plane will take off while you're doing that wheelie, and then you may have to push that nose forward to maintain in ground effect so you don't climb out of it.
All right.
So landing. You want to do kind of the opposite. You want to do a wheelie while landing, protecting that nose wheel, right? We don't want that nose wheel digging in.
So the big thing that I've heard a lot from students that just took their test is that the examiners are looking for that minimum sink rate on the VSI. So I know some people prefer to add in power right around the time of the enter and ground effect. They add in a small amount of power. I've also had success with leaving power in all short final all the way down to touchdown.
Yep.
Usually about 1,000 RPMs or so, give or take, in the Cessnas.
Yeah. It'll make your landings a little bit smoother too, right? As you come down. Thing to be aware about, how much runway do I have with power? Because now if you're doing a short field grass landing, well, it's probably one of the worst case scenarios you could have, right? Because you want enough distance to slow down, and that grass will slow you down pretty fast, though, because of the friction between the tire compared to, think about like driving on grass compared to.
That's also going to depend on how hot it is.
Yes, that's another thing too.
All right. So also another big thing that I know they're looking for is that you're maintaining that back pressure on the yoke to keep that nose wheel off of the grass.
By the time you finish this maneuver, that yoke should be back all the way in your chest, right? You should have it all the way. They don't want to see you still having it forward, because if I land and push it forward, right, that puts a lot of pressure on that front wheel, and we want to protect that nose wheel.
Right. All right. So the standards for that, plus 10, minus 5 for your approach speed.
Oh, and one sec, we just got a question. So why is there a lower than usual traffic pattern altitude?
Oh, at South Jersey. That I'm not 100% sure on.
The FAA,
I think it might be sort of noise abatement.
yeah, the FAA doesn't really specify why. They just put it there, and we just have to kind of know. I've never really seen. Sometimes it may be higher for an obstacle or anything,
Right.
but I've never really seen a reason why there is. If there probably is, you probably search it up, but I'm not too familiar with that.
Yeah, we'll look into that a little bit more too.
Yeah. Oops, sorry.
No.
So soft field takeoff and land. So, as Joe said, these are the standards.
So it's almost like a normal approach in landing
Mm-hmm.
for the most part, even with the standards.
Yep.
It's just that last bit where you want to keep that nose protected
Yes.
and maintain a minimum sink rate.
Yep. And you can see for tricycle airplanes, keep the nose wheel off of the surface until loss of elevator effectiveness. That yoke all the way back, once that nose wheel comes down, that yoke being back, that's when you lost that elevator effectiveness because there's not enough air blowing over the wing.
All right.
All right.
Field takeoff.
So short field takeoff. They all sound the same.
So what is a short field takeoff simulating?
Limited amount of runway and possibly an obstacle in front of you. As you can see, there's a tree here, right? This may be 1,000-foot runway or a 1,500-foot runway for an Cessna. I think, what's the one up near New York that has a short runway with the lake? Andover Aeroflex, I think it is.
Yeah.
So they have a pretty short runway. I forget exactly how long it is, but that's where you would want to use this short field takeoff. So how do we perform this?
It's almost exactly like a short or soft field for the setup, at least 10 degrees of flaps.
Yep.
Except now you're going to try to maximize the runway by getting all the way over to like almost in the grass. Hold the brakes. Once you apply full power, confirm engine instruments are in the green.
That's an important stage. You always want to make sure those engine instruments are in the green on any takeoff you do before you start.
Right. Then you release the brakes. Rotated VR, maintain VX until clear of obstacles. So I've heard some people do it at 50 feet where they protect the flaps. I've heard others where they say their instructors taught them not until 400 feet. It's one of those things I feel like you should ask the examiner before, because if you go over to the standards on it too.
And it's also above obstacles too. Yeah, that's going to be the main thing.
Yeah, because even in the standards, it says until clearing the obstacle or until the airplane is 50 feet above the surface.
Which one is that?
That's going to be
right here. Oh, yeah. Until clearing the obstacle.
All right. So there's a little room for interpretation.
You just make sure you're specifying where the obstacle is at, right? If you're at 500 feet, say, oh, there's an obstacle here. I'm clear of the tree. I'm lifting up my flaps now.
Okay. And here we have sort of a practical example of short field takeoffs and landings.
Before you do these, you want to check in the POH for these charts, because you don't want to take off, find out you can't climb above this obstacle wherever you're at.
Right. So the first thing you want to do is get your pressure, altitude, and your temperature. And take the numbers there, read the notes, make sure that the runway is not going to be too short. Like in this case, we have a 1,500-foot runway. So on a nice cold winter day, at sea level, give or take 500 feet, should be fine. Now, if that airport was at 3,000-foot pressure altitude on a 40 degrees Celsius day, it's a whole different story.
Cool. That's a hot day too, 40 degrees. So we're a warm summer day. And then the other thing is with this, right? It's not just this distance here. You also have to read the notes, right? So these distances are one thing, but as we can see, for operation on dry grass runway, increase distance by 15% of the ground roll figure. So you want to make sure, all right, if I'm at 8,000 feet and taking off a 40 degrees Celsius day, clear 50-foot obstacle, I need 4,615 feet. Now, if I'm on a grass runway, I have to add 15% of that. So now you're adding a little bit more distance to that. So it's not just, oh, I'm good this. Make sure you read these notes in any chart on there.
Right. And if the examiner gives you maybe a airport for your cross-country plan that has a short runway, they're definitely looking to make sure you're using these charts for both takeoff and landing.
They want to make sure that you understand how to read the chart. And that's why it's important. And we go through them a little bit in the cross-country planning too.
All right. So this is the
Joe and Andrew. Noel raised his hand, and there's a question in the chat as well.
I think I only have the one about the TPA.
Yes.
Or is it
that one was answered.
Yeah.
I didn't. Yeah. And then Noel raised his hand before.
Yeah. So before we go into the next one, Noel.
Maybe I'm just ignorant when it comes to the short runway takeoffs. Help me understand how what you're doing exactly with the flaps. Like, can you go through that again really quick? Because I know you said something about are you taking off with flaps in, and to what degree and why?
So
you want to take off with 10 degrees of flaps.
Yeah.
So that gives you a little bit more lift. You're able to climb a little bit faster to get above any obstacle you need.
And it also gives you more drag so you don't go quite as far.
Yes. But normally flaps
airborne a little bit quicker.
Exactly. It helps you climb fast because that 10 degrees of flaps gives us a little bit more lift and drag. So does that make sense?
Did that answer the question?
Or? Yeah. You answered the question. I was just thinking about how that, like, when it comes to slow flight, I don't know if you would like slow it down too much by accident, having too much flap and just hit the tree. Anything.
Yeah. But yeah, so it's only 10 degrees of flap.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. So the landing portion.
So
almost exactly the same as the normal approach.
Yep.
Fly stabilized, slow yourself down, full flaps. Keep your recommended approach speed. So the really big thing here is just trying to get that right on the aiming point.
Yeah.
Stopping short.
Because you have to stop within, I believe we'll see in the next one, but I think it's 200 feet. We'll see in the next one though. But you want to get down on your point, right? Because we don't have much runway in front of us. We have to land and start applying our brakes. We have to stop in this given amount of distance. If we don't, we may overshoot the runway. So always try to aim for your point. Maybe if you have enough too much airspeed, you could also start your flare out a little bit earlier. I know at Princeton with the displaced threshold, sometimes what students will do is say, I'm aiming for the numbers, but they'll actually start their flare above the displaced threshold. Right.
And look at that, we got a nice little displaced threshold in the picture.
Yep. This looks exactly like Princeton.
Yeah, there you go. Well, that was a number.
Yeah, almost.
Yeah, close enough. Yeah, usually if you're aiming for like that second arrow, like the long arrow, you'll put it pretty close to your touchdown.
Because you got that distance where you're going to glide a little bit or float a little bit. Sorry.
I know also some examiners, after you land, they want you to put the flaps up to transfer the weight from the rest of the wheels.
So the reason why we want to do that is because when we have those flaps down, we can start flying at a lower airspeed. So if we lift those flaps up, that puts more of the weight of the aircraft on the tires, which allows us much better braking efficiency. Because otherwise you could be applying the brakes and all of a sudden there's not enough weight and your tires are skidding down the runway because you're still kind of in the air. Yeah. All right. As we see here, so these are, this is a chart. And yep. So here, touchdown at the proper pitch attitude within 200 feet beyond or on specified point. So, you have 200 feet. That's about 2 center stripes around. So you have to make it down. If you're aiming for numbers, you have to make it down before the end of the second center line stripe.
Yeah. So I think it's kind of important to note that the ACS doesn't want you to land before your point.
Yes.
They want that accuracy of landing on or a little bit beyond, 200 feet beyond.
Yeah. Because otherwise, if you're landing before, you're technically, if it's short, it's a real short field, you're not landing on that runway. Right, then we have a forward slip to land.
Okay, so what is the purpose of a forward slip?
So the purpose of forward slip is to descend fast without gaining airspeed.
Right. So I have mixed feelings on the forward slip.
Oh,
I feel like it's a fun maneuver,
yep.
but it shouldn't be in place of a good stabilized approach. You
Yes.
shouldn't be having to do a forward slip every time you're flying an approach.
That's cheating.
Yes.
It's not an excuse for a bad landing.
Zach. Um,
But what the forward slip essentially does is you're turning the aircraft. If you look at my hand, right, if this is the plane flying straight ahead, you're turning the aircraft this way, but allowing it to still travel straight, exposing the side of the aircraft of the body, adding a ton of drag. So you're able to descend, but that drag is keeping you slower. It's like using the body of the aircraft as another flap almost, except it has much, much more drag.
right. And also, when you put that full rudder in, when you have to take that out, it just makes it a little bit more wonky sometimes.
Yes,
If you don't have enough experience,
exactly.
and then you're going to have a bad landing on your exam.
Yep.
And yeah.
And it is not recommended to do this with 30 degrees of flaps. So you want to try to do it with at least 20, and you'll actually see in the notes and assessment it says slips with 30 degrees of flaps not recommended. I believe I forget exactly what it says, but it's right near the flaps if you ever, when you're in the plane, try to take a look.
Yeah, I believe it was also more so for the old like 40 degree of flap settings.
But you still may not want to do it with 30 degrees.
Yeah.
And like we said, it's not an excuse for a bad landing. When I teach my students, I like to say, all right, you're only can do this in emergency situations, right? If you're not gonna get the plane down, go around. Don't try to fix a landing with it because you could become unstable.
Right.
With that, we talk about go arounds.
Yeah, every instructor's favorite thing.
Oh yeah.
So,
Can I ask a quick question
yes.
before we move on from the short runway landings? Is there like a recommended airspeed chart deal, depending on the length of the runway or whatever that you can actually look up?
So you mean for the airport, or like seeing how far the plane can actually land and what distance?
Yeah.
That one, how much the plane can land?
So, as far as the actual how far the plane can land, the pilot's operating handbook, the POH, in section 5, it has all these charts in here.
So you can see on a very cold day, your rollout distance in a seven could be 545 feet. Would we be able to do that? This is an exact test pilot, so we most likely, I know I can't put it down 545 feet, but these are in ideal conditions, so maybe add a little buffer.
Yeah, because also wind's going to play a factor in that too.
Yes, and that's why
if you get a crosswind, it's definitely.
Yeah. So this is where pretty much you can see the distance to clear a 50-foot obstacle and also your ground roll. So you can see before you get to go to an airport with a small runway, you can make sure that the aircraft can land in that distance. And if you want to see how long the runway is, you can go to that AFD chart or the chart supplement, or ForeFlight will tell you if you click on runways.
Did that answer your question? All right. And
Go around.
Go arounds. All right. So,
what's our first step in the go around?
Full power.
Yep. So that power is going to help you get away from the ground.
So usually they will test you kind of if they see that you're having an unstable approach, they'll want to see that you're making the decision to go around. They're not going to just say, okay, now do a go around unless you've been blind perfectly and don't need to do one.
Yep.
So they want to see you can also not just fly a go around, but make the decision to go around.
Yeah. Because they want to make sure you're not going to say, oh, I can land it, but meanwhile, the plane's almost sideways and you're 50 feet off the runway, almost landing on a taxiway. They want to see you go around if you find out you're unstable on the landing. They don't want to see you try to force the plane down.
Right. And then they want to see that you're transitioning to climb out at VX or VY as appropriate. And verify a positive rate of climb.
Yes.
So what would a positive rate of climb be?
On your VSI indicator, you would see it go above 0.
What if your VSI isn't working? It's not a required.
Your altimeter would start going up.
Exactly. All right. And just maintaining VX and then VY to a safe maneuvering altitude.
Yep. And sometimes if you're low too, you may actually, if you're low and slow, right? Like if you bounce a landing, you may actually have to try to ride out in ground effect as you're smoothly lifting those flaps. Because if I try to climb up, I possibly could enter another stall, or I could enter a stall, not another one. So just be aware of what your airspeed is, right? Remember, you may have to ride out in ground effect if you are that slow.
All right. And like we said, this part of the ACS, it's kind of both being able to fly it and being able to make the decision. If you look at the risk management, it does say applicant demonstrates the ability to identify, assess, mitigate risks, encompassing delayed recognition for the need of a go around or rejected landing.
Yep. And remember, lift those flaps up smoothly, never all up at once.
All right.
And we got steep turns. So this helps people get the scan going, right? So this helps, well, not scan, but level flight. It helps you with that horizon out there. So let's see.
What is a steep turn?
So 45 degrees.
Yeah. So we're looking for about 45 degrees on the turn. So what does that look like on our attitude indicator? If you look at the picture on the left, you can see right above that screw is a good 45-degree reference point. And also, if you go to the bottom portion of it, that line right there where Andrew's hovering is mounts. Yes, that is also 45-degree line. You can reference.
So you could actually put your miniature airplane line close to that, and it would match up almost 45.
Right. And then as far as the visual reference portion of it, we have two pictures on the right for both a right turn. You could see it's like right kind of at that cowling. And then on the left, you'd see the point on the nose, the spinner, kind of cutting through the horizon. So we're looking for both that bank and that nose to stay in the fixed spot.
Yes, and also verify that your altitude isn't changing if you have to change more nose up attitude or more nose down.
Yeah, and one also real quick thing about steep turns and ground reference and all the other maneuvers. It's really important to get yourself configured into solid, straight, and level flight before you even start it.
Yes.
And pitch for your VA.
Never try to rush into it.
All right, because if you go into it and your trim's all out of whack and your power settings are all over the place, you're setting yourself up for failure.
Or you're going to enter a turn, all of a sudden you're going to be losing 500 feet, you're going to be gaining 500 feet. Keep the aircraft, try to keep it stable, right? Try to get ahead of the plane, start to feel it. Oh, the nose is starting to descend. Maybe I'll pull back a touch. Because if you have to pull back a lot in a steep turn, you're going to start to feel the G's.
Yeah. All right. So
like we said, establish manufacturer airspeed if one's not available, and airspeed not to exceed VA. So you don't want to get faster.
Right. Roll into a coordinated 360-degree steep turn.
45 degrees. And if you are doing your commercial rating, it's going to be 55. But for the private standard, it's 45 degrees.
All right. All right. So maintaining your entry altitude plus or minus 100, airspeed plus or minus 10, bank plus or minus 5, roll out roughly at your entry heading. Also, one thing we didn't mention, clear the area.
Yes. For any maneuvers you do, clear the area, clearing turns, right? You want to be aware for any aircraft around you, right? You don't want to be doing maneuvers and there's another plane doing steep turns and they're real close to each other, right? That's why we also have the practice area frequency, 123.5. Always talk on there, right? Announce where you're at and what you're doing, and you'll hear where other people are at and what they're doing.
All right, ground reference.
So sorry, I have a question regarding this. The frequency you mentioned, does the what is it called? The practice area, I think? Right, okay. And is it usually based on like the area? Does it change, or how can we look them up?
So it's normally just
it's asking for different areas.
Oh, I gotcha.
Yeah.
I know practice area, ours is 123.5.
Yeah.
But it's also like common.
Like if you go to like down south, they don't have a practice area. So
yes.
So that monitor McGuire, like a flight server, or like the approach frequency.
Yes. So what a lot
of you could even ask for a flight following.
Yes, that's what a lot of people do when they go down towards McGuire. If they're going to be in that alert area, they're going to ask for flight following. Say, we're going to be doing maneuvers around here, and air traffic control device move any aircraft around. And it also helps them when they're trying to get IFR traffic in, like the big military jets. They know what you're doing.
Right.
But our main practice area, which is also like a plane-to-plane frequency, right? So if you want to talk to someone on a plane, it's kind of a more freed up frequency. But it's 123.5, and that'll extend. There's a few different flight schools all around us that use it.
Yeah.
And it normally extends from the reservoirs all the way to the lake over in PA. That's mainly where the general area is.
Yeah.
Using that frequency.
And so it is not stated somewhere like in a sectional or something, right?
Yeah, no, it's not stated. It's just it's kind of
Passed around the airport.
Okay, I see. Gotcha. Thank you.
Okay. So ground reference. I love ground reference too. I think they're very
we do it all the time when we're in the pattern.
So what is the point of ground reference? So
establishing wind correction angles, right? Because you may be flying like this, but the wind's blowing you this way as you're going straight.
Right. So getting used to doing crab angles as well as dividing your attention. Because now you have to look at your instruments for a second, look outside the airplane, scan for traffic, look at your instructor yelling at you.
We had to send low.
Bullies. All of them. All right. So there are three ground reference maneuvers that you are going to be, that you could be tested on, but the evaluator must select at least one for you to demonstrate. So that could be rectangular course, S turns, or turns around a point. So go to turns around a point. It's a big circle. So you want to just try to get your steeper banks, and when you have the wind behind you, shallower banks when it is in front of you. Don't confuse that with steep turns necessarily. You don't want to be doing 45 degrees of bank, 60 degrees of bank.
It's more of a controlled turn. It's not. And give yourself distance between the point two. You don't have to be right on top of it.
Right.
But the main thing, the purpose of this maneuver is to have a constant circle, right? Because if I maintain one bank the whole way around, this wind's going to drift me this way more, and I may come back around and actually end up turning in here, if that's my point.
Right. And S turns is basically the same principle. You want to start with your wings level on a road. As you enter, you want to enter on the downwind. As you begin your turn, steepest bank with the wind behind you, and just slowly start bringing that bank out to the shallowest point. And you want to try to end up wings level over the road again. And vice versa. When the wind's in front of you, start shallow, steepen it out as you go until you can get wings level over the road.
Yep. So you're switching them up depending on if you're in the downwind or if you're flying in the upwind, essentially. Right? Our downwind is when we have the wind on our tail. Upwind's when we're forcing or trying to fight that headwind.
Right. And the rectangular course.
We do this every day when we're flying loops in the pattern.
All right. So same principle. Wind's behind you, steeper banks. Wind's in front of you, shallower banks. So now with all these three maneuvers, you want to complete them at about 600 to 1,000 AGL on your test. So be aware of the terrain in the area, especially like the practice area. Look at your sectional beforehand. Or if a lot of examiners test out like our Ocean County. So do a little research beforehand and look at the elevation of the area so you can kind of plan ahead.
Of what altitude to do it at. Because down the beach, it's almost at sea level. But then you gotta watch out for some towers around or
right. And with all of these maneuvers, I believe it is plus or minus 100 feet.
Yep.
As well as plus or minus 10 for your airspeed.
Yep. And as we said, traffic avoidance and ground track while maintaining coordinated flight, right? Dividing attention as we talked about earlier. All right.
I know the
slow flight. This is my favorite maneuver. And I feel like I have one more. Forget. So slow flight, right? We teach you this in the air so you know how to come into land with the plane, right? I always say it's like the Mr. Miyagi from the Karate Kid, where it was, all right, we're teaching you slow flight in the air, and now You don't know what it's really teaching you until we come in the land, right? So it's like wax on, wax off with the fence. Now, all right, land the plane. uh, so that's why we teach it up in the air when you first start flying, because we want you to understand how the plane is going to react, approaching, coming into land. So you know what to do when you're low to the ground, when you're slow, when you're fast, anything like that. So the first step when we get into slow flight, obviously we do our clearing turns before this. Once we're established on the heading, we're going to reduce our power to 1500 RPMs. As you reduce that power, right, that nose is going to want to fall. You're going to want to lose some altitude.
So there's one thing I want to kind of throw in there with the power settings as well. If you take note, estimated.
Yes.
So it might be a day where 1500 isn't doing it for you. You might need a little more. You might need a little bit less.
Exactly.
But a rough point to aim for is about 15.
That's why, as we can see, estimated, right? It doesn't have to be exactly.
Right. And at any point in the maneuver, if you know, even after you put those flaps in, you could always add power in.
Yes. Yeah, you could change the power setting.
Yeah.
Like I was saying, hold that altitude, right? Hold with that back pressure at first, because we're not pitching for speed, power for altitude yet. We want to hold that altitude by pulling that yoke back a little bit and slow it down. A lot of times I see people confused with the flap settings. So I try to make it standard with the numbers, right? You want your airspeed and your flaps to equal 100. So what I mean by that is when our airspeed is at 90 knots, you want flaps 10, right? So 90 plus 10 would be 100, right? Once we get down to 80 knots, put in flaps 20, 80 plus 20, 100. And then when we get down to 70 knots, flaps full, and then we're slowing down to 55 knots. Once we reach that 55 knots, we're pitching for speed, power for altitude, right? We're operating in a region of reverse command. When you fly normally, you're controlling your altitude with that yoke, right? By pulling back or pushing forward, and your airspeed with that power, right? More power gives you more speed, less power reduces your speed. But in slow flight, it's reduced. It's the region of reverse command. So once you are in the maneuver, around 1800 RPMs will keep you level. Like we said, it's going to vary from day to day, and some planes are a little bit different depending if it's the S model or the R model. But 1800 is kind of a good judgment point to stay level. You may just have to vary it. You also have to maintain plus or minus 100 feet, heading plus or minus 10 degrees, airspeed plus 10 minus 0 knots. So if you're aiming for 55 knots, you can't go below 55, but you can go up to 65. And you also knots and specified angle of bank plus or minus 10 degrees. Right. Anything else? No. Good. So some of the common errors, right? As we talked about, no clearing turns, right? You want to make sure there's no planes around you. Also, not holding back pressure when slowing down, right? So
I see that happen a lot. Usually, when a student gets fixated on an instrument, like they're looking at their airspeed the whole time, and they're pulling back, and now they're not looking outside or looking at their altitude, and they just start dropping.
Yep. Yeah. And you start to descend. So that's why I said you got to start pulling back on that yoke a little bit till you reach that 55 knots. Another thing is fixation on airspeed, right? Sometimes students just look at the airspeed. They won't realize if your nose is up, nose is down. That's how we figure out where our airspeed is going, right? Because that pitch is for speed, power for altitude. That left hand on the yoke is connected to your airspeed. That right hand is connected to your altitude on that power. So have that scan going.
And vice versa, there's also a fixation on the altitude.
Yes. All right. So it could be either or.
Fixation on anything.
Yep. Always have that constant scan going. We also have adverse yaw. We are slow, so we're going to have all those left turning tendencies, right? So we're going to have to add a more right rudder. And also power management, right? Not too much power, not too little. A lot of things.
Be gentle with slow flight. You don't have to jam anything.
Yep. But sometimes I know you got to remember you're going to climb slow, even if you put full power, and you're still going to climb pretty slow in slow flight.
Right.
It's slow flight. Never feel rushed in slow flight, right? That's the name of the game. Slow. Fly slow. Don't be rushed to go anywhere. And not more than 10 degrees of bank left and right when you're turning.
Stalls.
Oh man.
Right.
Doesn't mean the engine stalls.
All right. So talk about stalls.
Yeah. So stalls, right? This essentially if when the aircraft stops flying for a minute and we have to recover. So as we can see by the picture, you want to establish a normal approach speed. The power off stall, we have to start in slow flight. We can't start it just flying normally. So
if you're doing slow flight, you know what's coming next.
yes, it's most likely you're going to lead right into the power off stalls. So a lot of the time people forget that we have to start a descent before, right? We want to simulate we're coming into land. This simulate like you're coming into land, you're stalling the aircraft low to the ground. But we do it high up in the air, so you do get yourself into a situation, you understand how to recover the aircraft and how to get away from the ground. Right? So get that descent established, you can gain airspeed in this up to 65, right? If we're doing that 55, you can push that nose down, you can gain that airspeed that you need for that descent.
Right. So want to select an altitude no lower than 1,500 feet. Configure for slow flight. Step is descent. Maintain your heading, straight flight, specified angle of bank, not to exceed 20 degrees. So once the full stall occurs, like you said, full power.
Yep. Flaps up to 20 right away. And you want to get
establishing a climb.
Yes, you want to get that positive rate as soon as possible. You don't want to let that nose go right down to the ground, right? You want to get a nice stall, right? Nose goes down, and we're climbing out of it at possibly VX, fast as you can get there. But you don't want to pull back enough to get into another stall, right? Because to break the stall, you have to push the yoke forward.
And after you have that power in, you definitely have to put some forward pressure in.
Yes.
It's a little counterintuitive.
Yep.
So one common failure on the check rides for the power off stalls is developing the full stall too. You want to make sure you get that develop the full stall. You don't have to be aggressive with it.
Yeah, you don't want what we see all the time is people are pulling that yoke back, right? And you're in a very high nose attitude and keep pulling back, and all of a sudden that nose snaps down and you're almost looking at the ground, right? You can just hold that nose in the horizon, you'll get a slow buffet, and then you'll get a little drop, and it makes it much easier to recover.
Right.
So you don't have to force the stall, always let it come to you.
Yeah. All right. And after that, power on stalls. Same basic principle.
Except now you're not in slow flight.
Yep. Clear the area. Begin the maneuver no lower than 1,500 feet. And then you're going to get established into the takeoff configuration. So you're going to slow yourself down to approximately 55 knots. And then apply takeoff power. Some people do it with 65% power.
I always go full power with it. Because when you take off, you actually are going to be doing full power. And then, like we said, don't rush to stall. You don't have to force it to get there. That airspeed can be coming down slow, right? We don't have to force it. You could be climbing up for a few seconds, right? And it's going to make it much smoother if you just wait for the stall to come to you rather than forcing it. As I said, maintain specified heading, plus or minus 10 degrees, and not to exceed 20, plus or minus 10 degrees turn.
And a big part of, making a successful power on stall is coordinated flight.
Yes.
You don't want to put yourself into a spin.
Especially with this maneuver, there's a high, if you're not coordinated on that rudder, there's a possibility of going into a spin. So you want to keep that ball in the center and use that right rudder because you have all that full power and you are slow.
All right. So, sorry, go on.
And this one, like Joe said, we'll be in takeoff configuration, so we're not going to use flaps. So all you have to do is lower that nose and then get a climb out. All right. Anything else?
We're good on that.
All right.
Go on to
spin awareness.
Since we started talking about spins. So they're not going to make you do a spin on your private pilot check ride. But they do want you to be aware of what a spin is, how it can develop, and more importantly, just like with stalls, it's more important to know how to get out of a stall than to get into a stall.
Yes.
So they want you to know that acronym, PAIR. Power to idle, ailerons neutral, rudder, opposite of the spin, and then elevators, you might need to push forward to break the stall.
And then pull out of it. To get that nose away from the ground. And they just want to know that the factors, the situation that could lead to that, like a power on stall not being coordinated and all of that. All right, pilotage and dead reckoning. So this is going to be when you do that cross-country flight plan, right? This is going to be your nav log. They want to see you have a route, altitudes, understanding when you use those altitudes, right? Those VFR, that 1,000 plus 500, and depending on what heading you're going to, if it's even plus 500 or odd plus 500.
Right. So, I mean, they check off most of that stuff as you go with the oral portion.
Yeah.
With the pilotage.
They'll go over.
Yeah. And they're not looking for perfection with the numbers, but they are looking to see that, if you are off by 20 degrees, you're able to notice that in the air and say, okay, I need to correct 20 degrees left or right.
Mm-hmm. And also for your times, you actually have a buffer area of 5 minutes, right? So which 5 minutes is actually a pretty long time, right? So if I'm saying, oh, it's at my time, I still don't see my destination, and I see it 4 minutes later, that's all right. But I got to change my times depending on how long it took me because possibly that wind change, now I'm facing more of a headwind. So you have 5 minutes in between points where your time can be off. Some of the common errors with this is points are farther than about 15 nautical miles.
Yeah, I usually suggest trying to keep your points about 10 miles.
Yes.
Maximum.
You can go a little bit over, but be aware, right? You could lose your track. You want to make sure you know where you're going and how long. You don't want to lose your last point if you don't know where you're at.
Especially if the visibility is below 10 miles. Might take an extra second or two. You might get a little disoriented.
Yep.
So try to pick
closer points.
Closer. And noticeable.
Yes.
Don't pick outlines of cities.
Yeah. I'm not going to say, oh, my house is down there, and I'm going to try to spot it. I want big points. Another thing is failure to update ETA. So if your time, like we said, you have that 5 minute buffer. If it's off, you have to adjust your time in the air. All right, this took me 2 times, or let's say if it was 2 minutes to my next point, and let's say it took me 4 minutes. All right, now I'm going to double my next time, update that estimated time of arrival so I know what the wind is doing, and I'm constantly changing that depending on what's going on with the wind. Also, some calculations incorrect or missing on your chart, and also wrong charts used, right? If I'm trying to use different, like a sectional that's in California, thinking I'm flying to this airport, but I'm actually over here flying from Princeton to Sky Manor, right? If out of how you mix up airports, but you don't want to use.
Well, I think more importantly, you can mix up in Princeton area. We have our charts split up right in the middle.
Yeah,
like it's like so close together. So if you're going south and you brought 2 old sections,
you're gonna need 2 charts.
All right. But that's easy to kind of mix up because you see 2 sectionals with Jersey on it.
Yeah. And you think, oh yeah, we can just use one. But that's where ForeFlight makes it easy.
All right. We're spoiled.
Yeah. Then we have some navigation systems. So using VORs and GPS, you want to understand how they operate and work, right? If I'm trying to use it and I have no clue, especially with the 430, you really have to focus on what you're doing with the 430. So if you're just learning it in the air, you're trying to mess with it and your eyes are just on the 430, the plane's going down, it's climbing, it's in a turn, right? So you want to learn how to use this stuff on the ground.
Right. And Princeton actually has a really good 430 and 530 simulator that I usually use. I take students in there and let them screw around the buttons.
Yep. Kind of learn how to use the equipment.
Right.
And understanding their limitations.
Without getting thrown around the cockpit.
Yes. That's why if you're setting up frequencies, anything, try to do it on the ground because when you're flying, sometimes when you're first learning it, it's difficult dividing your attention between flying and using the navigation systems. So something, right, you want to understand the ability to identify limitations, distraction, loss, situational awareness. You want to be aware of these things, right? Like we say, you don't want to lose flying the plane because you're trying to focus on tuning in a frequency or anything like that.
Right. And they give you a little bit more of a buffer, the ACS, on the actual navigation of the systems.
Yes.
So you have plus or minus 200 for your altitude, and you have a buffer of plus or minus 15 degrees for your heading. So they know it's a little bit, I don't want to say overwhelmed, but you can get a little saturated.
Yeah, overworked with it.
But just don't let it go too far.
Exactly. So some of the common errors, one thing that they will do on a check ride before I go into this, the common errors, most likely you're going to say, oh, I'm going to use GPS to divert me to this airport. They're going to say, all right, your GPS just broke. What are you doing now? So that's what most DPs do. They won't want you to use GPS. They want you to use VORs.
The nerve.
Try to get your distance times, everything else. But when you are using VORs, right, you got to be aware with the 430, are you on your VLOC setting or your GPS?
$1 million button.
Yep. Because otherwise, if you're on GPS, those needles are going to be taking you to the wrong place.
If they're taking you anywhere at all.
Yeah, that's the other thing, if they even pop up. So make sure on that bottom left hand, on the bottom left of the screen on the 430, it says VLOC, not GPS when you're trying to tune a VOR. Or if you're using GPS, make sure it says GPS, not VLOC.
Right.
Also, another thing is a failure to tune in the VOR, right? So when you go into the VOR, you have to hear that Morse code. So on the 430, you actually have to press the ID button, which is the volume for the VOR, for it to actually play, plus that nav 1 on the top.
Right. And something I see a lot of too is a lot of people, they just kind of say, oh, I hear Morse code, that must be it. Make sure you're checking it with the chart supplement, or not charts, or the sectional chart supplement, whatever you have available.
Always verify.
Exactly. Trust but verify.
Yes.
I have had 1 or 2 students where we were trying to go to Solberg and we had Robbinsville's frequency in.
Yep. And you're hearing.
Yeah, and they hear a Morse code, they're like, all right, I got it. And then we're headed south.
Yep. And it's the wrong VOR, right? Even though you hear it, those sectional charts, they have the Morse code on it. So always verify that you're going to the right one. Another thing is reverse sensing. With the G5s in 3-8 November and 8 Mike Charlie, we don't have this. But if you go in like 5-4 uniform or 3-8 Foxtrot, they have the older style VORs and not the screen with the G5s. So you have to make sure if you're going to the station that arrow or flag has a to indication. If flying away from the station, has a from. Because if you're flying to the station with the from indication, you're going to have to turn opposite ways. And you'll see this in the plane when you go into a little bit about VOR lessons or anything like that.
Make sure it makes sense.
Yes. If you turn one way and it goes away you don't want, you're probably reverse sensing. The other thing is not establishing a wind correction angle. So as you're on the radio or anything, you're going to have to establish a wind correction angle, otherwise that wind's going to drift you.
And that's just a lot of trial and error.
Yeah, exactly. You're going to see it's going to drift you and get back to center line and then kind of figure out your headings.
Yeah, so you don't want to overcorrect for it either.
Yeah, you want to be around where it's going to keep you on that line. Another thing is entering in the wrong identifier. Like say you put in the wrong frequency or identifier in GPS. It's taking you to California now.
Yeah, so you, like I said, just make sure it's making sense. If you put in Solberg's identifier and it says 53 miles away, we're at Princeton, something's off.
Yes.
Or if it's taking you south.
Probably something you may want to take a little bit closer look at.
Yeah, so just do your homework beforehand and maintain that situational awareness.
Exactly. Then we move into diversions. So diversions could really be for multiple reasons. The main thing that they tell you on a check ride is probably, oh, there's weather or anything. But diversions in real life could be, oh, somebody has to go to the bathroom. We gotta go get water. It could be any reason. So what the DPs are really looking for is, can you find the airport? Can you use all the nav aids available to you? And this is where you may use GPS. And they say, oh, you lost GPS. All you have is VORs now.
All right.
So you want to make sure that you can make it to the airport, and what nav aids do you have to help you find it? We want to know alternates along your route. If you already know your route that you're going to fly, try to see what airports are around because they're probably going to divert you to one of those. So be aware of where the airports around you are. Also, if you got time farther out, they want to see you do a time, distance, fuel calculations. So try to get around how long it's going to take you there, what's the distance.
And I think it's important to note that the ACS doesn't want you to, you don't have to be precise with your heading and ground speed. If you look at the skills, it says make a reasonable estimate of your heading, ground speed, arrival time, and fuel consumption. So if you're around the Solberg area and you want to divert back to Princeton, if you were to turn around and say, okay, going to be about 50 minutes to get back there, then yeah, no, that's not going to go great. But if you say, yeah, it might take about 10, 15 minutes to get back.
You want a general idea.
Right.
And same thing with this, just like if you're with tuning GPS or anything, plus or minus 200 feet and heading plus or minus 15. You can't have the plane all over the place, right? You got to have have it under control. Another main thing that a lot of people forget to do is get the weather, right? You're trying to focus on, oh, my time, my airport. Oh, there's the airport. Now I got to switch over to frequencies too. Remember to get the weather. If you don't know the weather too, you could also do other options. Like if we don't have ACS or AWAS at Princeton, right? You could listen to Trenton's ATIS, or you could overfly the field, kind of see what the windsock is doing, see which runway to land.
Yep.
All right, some of the common errors. So failure to note time, unsure how much fuel we have. Always make sure you know how much fuel you have. You don't want to run out of fuel in the air. So that's why it's a big part of our pre-flight. Calculations are way off, right? These times are estimated. So like Joe was saying, if it's like 15 minutes and it's actually only 10 minutes, well, that may be a problem. The other thing is getting lost, right? So if you know where you are, try not to lose your point. Sometimes you may feel a little bit rushed, especially if it's weather, but if it's divergent for another thing, we have time in the air. We don't have to rush to this point. Let me get situated. A lot of the time people feel rushed with doing diversions, but remember, take your time, get yourself situated. But obviously, if there's weather, now it depends where it's coming from. You may want to try to get down. Then you have a little bit of pressure. Not turning towards airport. As soon as we know our estimated heading, possibly turn for the airport and start looking out for it. And also, like we said, getting weather for airport.
All right. So now you're on your check ride and you got lost.
Uh-oh. Where are we at?
What do we do? The loss procedure, the 5 C's.
Number 1.
Confess. So that confess
Don't
isn't just for, confessing to ATC. It's more so confession to yourself. Admit to yourself that you're lost.
Yes.
And admit to the examiner.
Yeah. Don't let your ego get to you, right? Everyone gets lost at some point, try to find their way around, right? We got to try to figure it out, figure out where we're at.
Okay. Next step. Climb if you can. So one thing I see with that too is you want to climb with consideration to what's above you.
Mm-hmm.
If the clouds are at 3,000 feet and you're at 2,000,
and your VFR,
make note of that.
Yeah, you're not going to want to climb into the clouds, because the main reason they climb is to get better visibility, right? If I'm higher up, I can see the reservoirs way over there, or I can see different points. But if I'm in clouds, obviously you're not going to see anything, so you don't want to climb through those, and you're not allowed to check your VFR.
Right. Okay. Conserve. Fuel, and could even be space.
Yeah.
You don't want to get yourself more lost by going in a direction where it's unknown.
Exactly. So then you may not have enough fuel to make it to your point.
Right.
Next thing, communicate. This goes a little bit with confess. A lot, especially if you're contacting ATC, sometimes it's difficult to say, hey, I'm lost, but they're going to help you find your way.
Comply. Do what they tell you.
Yeah. If they tell you fly this heading, fly that heading, they're going to lead you back to where you want to go.
Right. Unless it's something that you think might, put yourself in further danger, whether that be a cloud, because ATC can't see all those clouds.
Yes.
So if they tell you to turn left and it's a cloud, don't do it.
Yep. Say, I got an issue. I can't go that way.
All right. Comply within reason.
And as we can see in the ACS, methods to determine position, so using GPS, VORs, or ground reference, right? I know the reservoirs here, right? I know Princeton's in this general direction. Anything like that you can use, right? And maintain appropriate heading, climb as necessary. Pretty much just, like I said, the 5 C's. All right, instrument maneuvers, straight and level.
Yeah.
So for your private pilot, you have to have at least 3 hours of simulated instrument time. So they do this because if you inadvertently go IMC, they want to know you have a general basic understanding of how to fly with your instruments. So the main thing is you want to trust your instruments. You want to cross-check all your instruments, cross-check making sure that one's working, because if I see one indication on this and the other 2 are indicating something else, maybe that one instrument has an error. So you want to know your systems.
Yeah, so definitely double check your instruments before you take off. Make sure your attitude indicator, especially, I know sometimes they might be a little cocked,
a little sideways.
Yeah. So check on your pre-flight, take note of it, because if the examiner just throws the foggles on you and now you're trying to keep that one
attitude indicator in the center and it's actually off.
Yep. So in that case, you could use something like your heading indicator to make sure you're flying straight and level.
And that's where verifying with your instruments, that cross check comes in handy.
Right.
So here we go with those cross checks, right? So you can kind of see your pitch instruments, right? So you can use your attitude indicator, right? It'll show your degrees of bank up or down. Your altimeter will show you climb if you're above the horizon. Your airspeed indicator will probably show a decrease if you're climbing because you're climbing. And your vertical speed indicator would show you climb or descent, right? So if I have one indication showing me something wrong, then I can cross check it, right? If my attitude indicator is giving me errors and my altimeter, airspeed, and vertical speed indicator are all indicating the same, my attitude indicator has probably failed. I need to trust these other instruments.
Right. So I don't think on a private pilot check ride they're going to make you go partial panel.
Mm-hmm.
They won't go out of their way for it.
Yeah.
But they're hoping that, you pick up on those things.
Yeah. So they're going to have a basic understanding. So as you can see the chart, bank instruments, you still use the attitude indicator, heading indicator, magnetic compass turn coordinated, and your power instrument, your airspeed indicator, engine instruments, whether that be manifold pressure isn't in the 172s, your tachometer or your EPRs aren't in the 172s, mainly your tachometer.
Yeah.
But if you fly more higher performance aircraft or more complicated aircraft, they're going to have manifold pressure or EPRs. So here's just another chart. I won't go over this too much, but as you can see, attitude indicator, altitude, side, airspeed, attitude indicator, DG, your compass, and your turn coordinator. You can see in each of these charts, straight and level flight, these instruments should be indicating this. Then we have constant airspeed climb, so you're going to have to possibly climb. It shouldn't be too long. When they put you on their fog, it should be, all right, turn left to right, make sure you can maintain altitude and heading. They want to make sure you can climb at constant airspeed, a level off, and plus 200 feet, heading plus or minus 20 degrees, and airspeed plus or minus 10 degrees. And same thing, here's a chart with the climbs, and a constant speed descent. Pretty much all the same thing. If you want to go back and look at this, the webinar should be online. But I won't bore you with saying all your attitude indicator goes this way or that way. But these are all how they should indicate. All right. Turns to headings. And unusual attitudes. So
love unusual attitudes. Every instructor will tell you they love unusual attitudes.
We'll say, all right, close your eyes. We're gonna turn the plane.
That's our time to shine.
Exactly. That's for a few seconds of flying in the plane.
Make our students nice and sick.
So this could be in real life scenarios, could be for anything, possibly turbulence. You're disorientated. You have an instrument failure. You're trying to trust them. You find out, oh, you're in a 45-degree bank. Confusion or occupied with other duties like trying to tune stuff into the GPS. So we teach you how to correct the aircraft, how to look at your instruments and understand, oh, it's indicating this. If I continue like this, I'm going to enter a stall. So I'm going to have to pitch the nose down, or I'm in a nose low attitude and I'm gaining airspeed. If I don't pull the nose up, I'm going to end up gaining a ton of airspeed. So this is mainly the things that will throw you into, right? The nose low descending turn. We'll also talk about nose high climbing turn after this.
Right.
But you can see your engine instruments indicating
you're in a descending turn.
Mm-hmm. So that airspeed's gaining, right? Because you're losing altitude. That attitude indicator is in the bank and you're
losing altitude.
Yep.
Turn coordinator. Mm-hmm. The heading indicator, turning.
Mm-hmm.
Vertical speed's indicating a descent.
Yep.
The first thing you want to do is get that power out.
Mm-hmm.
I always think of it, you're facing the ground.
Yep.
Pull away from the ground.
Exactly. Reduce that power. When you're nose low, reduce that power because you don't want to go over that VNE speed, that red line right there. Because otherwise, if you try to pull out, you could exceed the load factor on the aircraft. So nose low, reduce the power, level wings, and then start to pitch up. Nose high climbing turn, you can see that
it's much the opposite.
Yep. So it's increased power, but you can see how in this one we actually pitch forward first before we level the wings. Where in the nose low descending altitude, we actually level our wings and then pitch up. So they vary a little bit, the two-step switch, depending on what you're in, because Reason why is you don't want to enter stall. If you don't pitch that nose forward, you'll probably get into a stall, especially if you're really nose high attitude. All right.
And also with the unusual attitudes, I feel like it's less practical. Well, not less practical. I like to practice it with my students sometimes, where I'll have them close their eyes and fly the plane. It just feels a little bit more realistic. Like if you were to drop a pencil or
Trying to find
or got buried in the cockpit, when you come out of it, it's a little more disorienting, I feel like.
Exactly.
So it's a little more realistic for a student to kind of practice that
Yes.
and see what it's like to get disoriented.
Because then they
don't
just
fly.
they disorientate themselves.
But
Next,
let's talk about emergency distance.
So emergency descent, it depends what your examiner, how he tells you to do it. But the main way that I know I normally teach it is I get those flaps down because I don't want to gain an airspeed to go over VNE.
So there's so much room for ambiguity with this.
Yeah,
because
it could go either way.
If you look at it, it says maintain the appropriate airspeed and configuration appropriate to the scenario specified by the evaluator.
Yep.
So now if the emergency is an engine fire, now we might not want to put flaps in.
Yeah.
Or if you have an electrical fire.
What it all depends on the situation. And that's why you always want to refer back to that POH. See what they have emergency procedures in there.
Yeah.
Which one's going to be which? So
you want to know your best glide speed first.
Yes.
Know what speed would put out an engine fire. Be aware of all your view speeds, really.
Yeah. And I'll talk about all those in the POH.
All right.
Like I said, pitch nose down and maintain, if you have flaps down, maximum flap extension speed. So if we have 30 degrees, obviously we want to aim for 85 knots. We're a little below. And then bank left and right up to 30 to 45 degrees. It allows you to descend a little bit faster because you transition that vertical component of lift to horizontal, which allows you.
And it also allows you to maintain positive load factors.
Yep.
During your descent.
Exactly. As we can see here, use bank angle between 30 and 45, maintaining a load factor.
Appropriate airspeed +0, -10.
10 knots. So, and level off at specified altitude plus or minus 100 feet. And what else is there?
Complete the appropriate checklist.
Yes. So remember, take a look, see, is there a checklist out, right? It's a good thing to go back into POH and just review over your checklist when you're sitting at home, right? This way you have a general idea.
And also, if the scenario they give you is something that might have been something that could be easily fixed, they want you to be able to pick up on that.
Yeah.
Like they want you to say, okay, mixture's out.
Yep.
That's now that it's in, you might touch it and they might say, okay, that just fixed the problem. On to the next maneuver.
Exactly. So always be aware. And that kind of goes into where we do our emergency approach to land. So this is if you have more of an engine out scenario, right? So let's say you're flying along and all of a sudden you lose an engine. What do? I always say, go back to what you learned in preschool, right? Go back to start, ABC. Just keep that acronym in mind. A, airspeed, 65 knots in our model.
S glide.
Yep, around 68 in the S models, but it's just around there. And use that trim to help you, right? It helps reduce that workload because now you're not pulling back on that yoke.
Right.
Another thing is go through the checklist, right? On the back of there, we have engine out checklist procedures that we have to follow. So go through that if you have enough time. If you're too low to the ground, don't worry about the checklist. A and B is your number one thing, right? We always do A and B first because if I actually lose an engine, I want the most amount of time in the air. And I also want to know if I can't get this restarted, this is where I'm putting the plane down.
Right.
And as you're doing the checklist, know, okay, a few things on the checklist. Now I'm going my landing site. All right, a few things on the checklist, landing site, because you see people get too focused on the checklist, right?
Right.
And then they end up overshooting or.
You can also, especially before the checklist, don't be afraid to take the extra 2 seconds before you start the plane. Run over an emergency checklist and develop a flow for it. Just touch the corresponding items on the checklist. Take 2 seconds and just say it out loud. So when You start pulling the power on you, you have it in your head and you have that muscle memory.
Yep, all right, end your quiz, this is what I do exactly. It's just second nature.
Right. You want to be able to get as much done before you get the list.
Yes. And you want to know it in your head, because if it does actually happen in real life, you're going to be much more confused. And that's why I always say learn ABCs. All right, ABCs go right there. Never hesitate on that, because the longer you try to figure something out, right, the less time you have in the air trying to get down to a point. So some of the things, if you're too high, you could extend. So, right, if you're flying around that field, extend that pattern. You can also do S-turns. Or what was the other one we talked about earlier? Yep, this is an emergency procedure at that point. So if you want to do it when we pull the power out, we're fine with that, right? It's just not an excuse for a bad landing. But emergency procedures, slips, whatever you got to do to get the plane down. If you're too low, fly directly to the landing site and maintain that best glide as close as you can, right? Because that's going to help you get to that distance.
Yeah. So usually a little bit better to be a little bit on the higher side if you have the runway for it.
Yep.
Rather than a little on the low side.
Yes.
You could always slip it down.
Yep. You have a lot more options to go down rather than climb.
Yeah. All right.
Right. And here's what they say. So, right, establish and maintain best glide speed plus or minus 10 knots. So, like I said, use that trim, because otherwise you're probably going to exceed that if you're still trim for a level flight.
Right. Configure the airplane.
Mm-hmm.
Then best place to land.
Yep.
Select suitable landing area.
And the most important thing is, if you can and you're close enough, try to find an airport. Remember, fields are a good option, but if you can find an airport, know that you can make it to the airport. I'm not going to try to make it to the airport just because I think it's an airport. I'm not fully sure if I'm going to make it.
Right.
I want to make sure I have a good landing site picked out, and airports are obviously great points to land. So take a look at your sectional for flight. You can kind of put a glide ratio on there too.
Yeah.
So
the big thing with that is going to be the altitude at which they pull the power on.
Yes.
If they do it at 5,000 feet, yeah, you got a couple minutes.
You got some time.
If they do it while you're doing after ground reference maneuvers at 1,000 feet,
you don't have the impossible
field.
So right, and complete the appropriate checklist again on the bottom, right? So always remember, checklist. That's going to guide you of where to go and how to troubleshoot the problem.
Correct.
All right, some common errors. Airspeed control, right?
Use that trim.
Yep, because when you look down at that checklist, when your head goes down, that yoke goes forward and you're going to gain airspeed. Poor judgment and selection of an emergency landing area.
Don't land on the wires.
Yep, there's a lot of wires in the practice area, so be aware if your landing field has the electrical wires anywhere around.
Right.
Failure to accomplish checklist, unless too low. So like we said, that's why A and B are first, because if I don't have enough time for this, I want to know I have the most amount of time in the air, and I'm also knowing where I'm putting the plane down, right? I don't want to try to mess with the checklist if I'm 500 feet above the ground. I'm focused on flying the plane. That's always your number one priority. And the last one, undershooting or overshooting the landing area.
All right.
So right, you want to make sure you can land in that area.
All right. So tied kind of into that emergency procedures. Equipment malfunctions.
Yep. Sometimes things are going to fail on you, right? So we want to know how to handle them. That's why we want to know our aircraft systems. If it does happen to you, what's the model that you love?
Yeah, don't get me started. Decide.
So we want to detect the problem, we want to estimate, and we want to choose, identify, do, and evaluate. So, right, we want to make sure we're doing all these steps in order, understanding, keeping it systematic. That's going to help you figure out the problem a little bit easier, find some solutions, outcomes, and then how to do these outcomes, and then talk about it. What could we have done better in this? You always want to debrief every flight, right? Whether it's just you flying anywhere, talk about what we've done, what could we do better? It's not always, let's fly, let's just go home. Right? Debrief, evaluate, go over everything.
I got a nice little list of potential situations.
Yep.
As well, scenarios, fuel starvation, loss of oil pressure, non-operative trim.
So you could have multiple different things, and we want to know, all right, what are we going to do? We have to figure out there is a problem first. then we have to estimate some outcomes. We have to choose which one we're going to go with, or estimate what we're going to do about it, choose what we're going to do about it, identify, yep, this is the one we're doing, and do it, and then talk about it later. All right. Then we have emergency equipment. So this is going to be whether if you're flying over.
So this might even appear more so on the oral portion as well. They might just ask you about the emergency equipment on board.
Yep. Do you need a life raft? Do you need a life jacket? Are you flying over water? Are you in mountainous terrain, right? Do we want to have survival supplies in case we land anywhere and we're stuck out there for a few days, right? Always want to be prepared for things that you don't expect. Right. Especially here, not so much, but if you go flying in Alaska or anywhere else where there's a big body of water over to Bermuda, if our 172 can make it.
Very fast.
Yeah.
Iron Man.
Yeah. But so you want to be aware of where you're flying and if you have to carry any emergency equipment. The other thing is night operations, as we can see here, not generally evaluated in the flight portion, right? Your check rides isn't during the night. It'd be difficult to do your maneuvers during the nighttime. So maybe a little bit in oral, right? If you saw, we talk a little bit in our nighttime webinar more about this, about our rods and cones, knowing when to use that bright light, when not to use that bright light. Your required equipment that you must have on the aircraft.
Right, as well as the hazard specific to fly. Exactly. You know the hazards and how to mitigate those risks.
And how to fly safely at night. They want to make sure that you have no clue how to fly at night and now you're unsure of the things to be aware about. Right. Like all the effects. All right. And our final slide is going to be
the hardest maneuver.
Yes. After a landing. So don't forget, even though the flight's done with, use that checklist. Never hesitate to pull that checklist out and go down on the list. Obviously, when you shut it down, you want to make sure your mixture is fully in and that prop has fully stopped before you turn those magnetos off. The reason we do that is it gets all the fuel out of the cylinders. Because if that magneto is, let's say, on left or right or even both, and there's still fuel in those cylinders, and somebody comes by and says, oh, this prop spins, it could kick over on them. So that's why we always go full lean with the mixture to make sure we get all that fuel out of the engine. So if someone comes over and accidentally turns it or anything, it won't kick on them and possibly start up. So always wait till that prop is fully stopped to turn those magnetos off. Another thing that you can do as a good check is magneto ground check. So what you do before you turn it off, you go over to off real quick, make sure the engine starts to shut down, then go back to both and then shut it off the proper way. What you're testing there is making sure if you shut the magnetos off that the ground hasn't disconnected and that it will shut off those magnetos. And like I said, park in the appropriate area. So don't be parking in the grass or anywhere near.
Park on Bravo.
Yeah, don't park on a taxiway. Pull the appropriate checklist and conduct the post-flight inspection, right? Make sure everything, you put the plane back just how you got it, or even better. Then securing it, tie it down, right? Because if it's a windy day the next day.
Like I said, this is the hardest part of the check ride, tying the knots.
Yes. There's a few different ones, but you can see it when you learn. We'll teach you how to secure the aircraft, how to shut it down, and everything else. But, all right.
Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Like I said, if you've got ideas for the future ones coming up, let us know. I will send out an email once this is posted. So it'll probably be posted on Friday. So it'll go out through Constant Contact so you can all get that. And on the links, they also will include the slides, just so you know. So you can always check that out afterwards if you want to have that resource. But I think that's it. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.
Have a good one.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Have a good one.